So let's start today, and today I want to use a set of slides that I have prepared for several occasions in which I have presented the methodology of the food insecurity experience scale. So let me start sharing my screen. And I think now everyone should see the slide on the main screen. So, first of all, what was the motivation for developing the food insecurity experience scale? And for us at FAO, the main motivation was the transition from the Millennium Development Goal to the Sustainable Development Goal. And the point that we want to make is, while extreme poverty and hunger were combined together in the Millennium Development Goal, in the SDG, there is a specific attention devoted to the broader concept of access to food and good nutrition for all. So it's no longer simply an expression of extreme poverty. It's no longer something that we should be concerned only because of the poorer countries in the world and the poorest population in the world, but food security is a broader concept that is potentially a universal problem that affects people everywhere in the world, although at different levels of severity. And that is the reason why we needed some additional indicators. In the context of the Millennium Development Goal, we only used two indicators, which was the prevalence of underweight children under 5 years of age and the prevalence of undernourishment, which is a proportion of population below minimum level of energy consumption, of dietary energy consumption. We needed an additional indicator. And this additional indicator has been defined as the prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity. So is the cumulative, the combination of the two. And it is measured using the food insecurity experience scale. The reason is because if we want to monitor goals that are more ambitious, but also as an agenda we hope to be more effective than the MDG agenda, we needed to have more nuanced indicators. But however, this means that there is a huge increase in the methods, standard, and tools that we need to address. So particularly for the agencies and institutions at country level that are responsible for collecting data, producing the indicators, producing the report, this is a big challenge because it increased a lot the scope of the statistical work that is needed to inform the SDG agenda monitoring. And in particular for food insecurity, we had to face the problem. Do we have valid indicators that can serve this need? And unfortunately, the answer, when we started working on when the ideas about the new Sustainable Development Goal agenda, which was in 2012 at the Rio Summit was first presented, we started to consider the alternatives. Of the various indicators that we could have used to inform the SDG monitoring, we didn't find a valid alternative. Because, for example, the food consumption score or the household dietary diversity score did not present a basis for ensuring cross-country comparability. And also, it is questionable whether or not you could use them in different contexts, because there was not enough experience. Both the food consumption score by WFP and the household dietary diversity score had been used mostly in the concept of poor community of developing countries. Then we had the household food insecurity access scale, and the Escala Latinoamericana y Caribeña de Seguridad Alimentaria, the ELCSA, which were valid measurement of food insecurity, but also could not be easily compared across countries. And then the only indicators that had been subject to sort of validation to cross-country comparability was the household hunger score, which had been proven to be quite robust across different settings. But the problem there is that, as you probably, some of you already know, the household hunger score is just a reduced form of the household food insecurity access scale that focuses only on the most severe conditions. So because of that, we needed to think of a different, a better indicator that could serve the need. And the innovation that the food insecurity experience scale has brought about is that we really took it seriously, the concept of measurement. And therefore, we tried to give substance to application of some measurement principles. So the first thing I would like to comment is that whenever you want to propose a measure, you need to create a system that is composed of three different objects, three different tools. You need the actual measurement tool, which in our case is a questionnaire, a module that you include in a survey. You need to have the description of the protocol that you need to follow to use the tool. And then you need a reference scale. If you don't have a reference scale, you cannot determine the possibility of comparing measures obtained in different contexts. Let's go to the content of this lecture today, which is the Rasch model. The strong claim is that there is a model that allows to create measurement scales in the context of social construct or latent traits. George Rasch was a mathematician working in educational testing. And the first application of his model was in evaluating the students' attainment. So how a teacher would grade the test that a student makes, and how is it possible to make sure that when two different professors, educators, provide an assessment of the competence of students in different classrooms, their classification can be compared. So how to control for the differences in the interpretation that the educator, the professor can make of the responses given by the students. And the model is quite simple, even though it hides a very deep level of sophistication. The expression that you see on the screen now is just the simple logistic function whose argument is a difference between two parameters. These parameters are labeled A and B. And then there are indexes that refer to the number of different subjects or items. So AI is the level of the attribute that I want to measure that is manifested by the ith individual. So eventually, this is our measures. This is what we are after. We want to learn what is the best guess, estimate of this parameter AI. And how do we do it? We do it by comparing the severity of the respondent or the level of the attribute. I will say severity because implicitly I'm thinking of food insecurity severity as the thing that we are measuring. But this could be, for example, the student competence. If this is in the context of an education testing, A tells me how good, how competent is the student, and B is how difficult is the question. In our case, in our application, A would be the severity of the food insecurity condition of a respondent, and B is how severe is the condition that is described in one of the questions that I ask. So essentially, what I want to model is, given that I ask a certain question, Bj is the severity of that question, or I ask to a student a certain test item, and Bj is the difficulty of that item, what is the probability that a student that have a competence level AI or a household that is facing food insecurity at the AI level will say yes to the question regarding Bj? Or what is the probability that the student whose competence is AI will respond correctly to the question Bj, that is the question that has a difficulty level of Bj? So our data, once we have collected the data, our data are a bunch of yes and no. Our data, which is Xij, is a matrix of data, will have value 0 if the answer was no, 1 if the answer was yes. We'll have value 0 if the student did not correctly address the question, 1 if the answer was correct. So in this sense, the data is the response that the ith respondent give to the jth item. And here is where the terminology item response theory comes about. Because what we analyze is the responses of subjects to items. And the assumption here is that both the item and the respondent have attributes that can be measured along a single one-dimensional scale. So here I'm saying both the severity of the respondent and the severity of the item can be measured along a same quantitative underlying measurement scale. Then the probability that a respondent will say yes to a certain question is a function of the distance between A and B. And let me show you what does it mean. This is the graph of the logistic function. So imagine that I have on the horizontal axis is my severity level, in which I can measure both the severity of the respondent and the severity of the item. And the logistic function represents what is the probability of observing yes, of having yes as a response to the question. This is called an item characteristics curve. When you have a test made of several items, you will have several of these item characteristics curve. And the point of the item response theory, in particular of the Rasch model, is that each item is positioned in a different level of severity. That's the intelligent part of creating a good measurement scale is to try and identify different items that can reveal different severity levels. So you want to have a large number of items, as large as possible, which represent different level of severity. For example, if you are I don't know if any of you have experience as a teacher. When you do a test, you don't want to have only very difficult questions or only very easy questions, because otherwise you will never be able to discriminate within your classroom who is really good and who is not so good. Because if you have only easy question, everybody responds correctly, and you don't know. The same, if you have only difficult question, nobody will answer correctly, and then you don't know. So the purpose of measurement is served if you have different items that span a certain range of severity. Here I have 3 potential examples, and now let's look at what happens if a certain respondent is presented with several items. So imagine now that I have a respondent that is located at this level of severity. The way I read the curve, the item characteristic curve, is that if I look at the point where the severity level of the respondent intersects the characteristic curve, I can read what is the probability that if I ask this person, the question B1, he will say yes. Now, here, according to this chart, the probability that individual AI will say yes to item 1 is larger than 0.5, but it's lower than 0.5 for item 2, and it's almost 0 for item 3. And this is what the Rasch model predicts, that if you have a positive number, because in this first case, AI minus B1 is a positive number. AI is greater than B1. And for those of you who know the logistic function, whenever the argument of the logistic function is greater than 0, is positive, the function is greater than 0.5. If the difference is negative, like for example with respect to item number 2, A minus B will be a negative number, then the model predicts a value that is less than 0.5. If the distance is very large, then the probability is close to 0 or close to 1, depending on whether the difference is positive or negative. So this is what is the logic behind the Rasch model. Let's interpret it in the context of food insecurity. If you ask somebody who's food secure, imagine somebody like me, a professional that works at quite high level for FAO, an international organization. They pay me enough money that I've never concerned about food, in the sense that I have enough money to procure food. So if you ask me any of the FIES question, I would say obviously no. This is because in this chart, I am down here. I am on the extreme level of food security. So on this side, and then you ask me a question that is down here. The distance is negative and is so large that the probability is virtually 0 for all items. On the other hand, imagine that somebody is desperate, is really food insecure, and you ask, are you ever worried about food? The answer is obviously yes. And this is because the distance is so large, it's a positive number, and the model predicts a number that is close to 1. Probability 1 means I'm sure. So this is the only logic that is behind the Rasch model. You say that the probability of affirming an item increases with the distance between the item and the respondent. For example, the more competent is a student, the more likely is that he will get the answer correct. The less competent is the student, the more likely is that he won't get the answer correct. And the more difficult is the question compared to the competence of the student, the larger is the closer is the probability to 0. At the same time, easier items will always be more likely to be responded correctly than difficult items. So you can look at this also from the point of view of a given respondent. The probability of saying yes will be always higher for the less severe items and lower for the more severe items. There is one important caveat here, and this is a little bit sophisticated from the analytic point of view, which is, okay, suppose that I have my Rasch model, I do some analytic, and I get an estimate of the parameters A and B. And this is done with the software by doing a maximum likelihood application. But is there any significant, any precise meaning to the actual numbers? The answer is no. The actual numbers, as you obtain from an application of the Rasch model, don't have an absolute meaning. Why? Because imagine that you got your numbers, and then somebody says, no, I propose that my numbers are equal to yours plus 100. So you say that A is 1 and B is 3, and I say, no, A is 101 and B is 103. I add a constant to all numbers, all measures. What happens? What happens is that when you take this difference, the constant disappears. So the model cannot identify the origin of the scale. You cannot really estimate absolute numbers. You only have differences, and therefore differences relative numbers means that your scale is only an interval scale, not a ratio scale. You don't have the origin. And this is calls on the importance of defining a reference scale. It's like the temperature. What really thermometers do is only detect changes in the temperature. But the moment in which you want to touch a number, you need to have some reference. And the reference is arbitrary. So the bottom line of this conversation is that as the probability depends only on the difference between the measure, the model only defines your measure up to an arbitrary constant. And therefore, we need to understand before comparing measures obtained with two different applications of the Rasch model in two different communities, in two different countries, in the same community, in two different moments of time, that we cannot compare the number directly. We need to first make sure that we calibrate them, okay? When we are, and this is the important point, when we are severity level and of the respondent of the item that are very close, the model only say that there is a 50% probability of reporting that item. 50% probability of saying yes is another way of saying, I don't know. It can be yes and can be no with the same chances. There are equal odds. So this is also to stress the importance of the uncertainty. That imagine I have only one question and I want to base my assessment only on that question. And this is something that I see very often done. People taking one question, analyzing how many people have said yes to that question, and pretending to treat it as an indicator. Well, among the people that have said yes to that question, there will be somebody that was absolutely certain that the answer is yes, that was very food insecure. But there may be others that are right there, could have equally said no. And therefore, how can you have any trust, any confidence in the single question as a measure of food insecurity? It's strongly affected by uncertainty. And therefore, this is the fundamental lesson. If you have a measurement scale, you should not consider each item independently of the other. It's only the combined response to all the items that provides the measure you need. You cannot pick one question and derive some implication from that question in isolation from the other. It makes no sense. It's denying the very concept of measuring something. Okay. Now, let me go through an illustration now.
I have a question.
Oh, yes, Rebecca. Sorry. I couldn't see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, a clarification. What happens if I'm wrong with the level of severity, let's say, of my items BJ? Because you explain us that we have different items BJ with a different level of, you said, difficulties, no? Going back to the example of the students. So, for example, I think that one question is very difficult. So I think that the difference between one student I, which is not very good, and this question should be very, very high, no? If the question is very difficult and the student is not very good. But what happens if I'm wrong and the level of severity that I'm assigned to the items is not the real one?
Very good. I think this is a very important question, and at the very end you revealed what is the problem in the way in which you're looking at the question. You say the level of severity or difficulty that I assign to the item. No, we don't assign severity level to the items. Actually, the severity of the items is a result of the analysis of the data. I may have some idea. I may have some preconceived idea that this is a difficult question. But then you ask this question to every class, and you discover that people answer correctly that question. What you have to do, you have to revisit your assumption and say, maybe this is, after all, it's an easy question. Why? Because the evidence tells me that most people get it right. That's the very definition of what is difficulty, no? So the answer, an important, thank you for the question, the important contribution is, in our application of item response theory, we don't have preconceived, pre-assigned severity. We discover the severity level from the data. And it's the combination of the characteristic of the people and the response to the item that allow me to tell how should I rank the items. Which one in this particular context is the more severe? You make a mathematical test at the elementary school level. You probably, the same question, you do it in China, and you get different results than you do it in Europe, because the education of children on mathematics is very different. Something that may look difficult for us, it's not so difficult for other people. So you cannot assume that there is an ex-ante severity of the level. Now, let me take an opportunity, because most of you have worked with the food consumption score, right? What is the problem with the food consumption score? Is this idea that the weights that you attach to each food groups are known in advance. and are the same across all the world. They are the same in different seasons of the year. So that cereals get a score of 1, 2, meat, dairy, and eggs get a score of 4. That's not what you need to do if you want to define a measure of food consumption. But let me try and illustrate more, because that goes to the question, why, sorry, somebody is writing on the chat.
It's me.
Okay,
I say that food consumption score, it doesn't respect the reality of food insecurity, because it's based on fixed threshold. So we have
what I'm saying, I'm first of all, I'm very, I want to be very careful that you get me wrong, you get me right. I'm not saying that the food consumption score is a measure of food security or food insecurity, because it is not. Otherwise, those who have proposed would have called it the food security score or the food insecurity score. It's supposed to be a measure of food consumption, and it's called the food consumption score. But also, as a measure of food consumption, you need to define what is food consumption. And the ambition there is to have a measure that pulls together two aspects, a quantitative aspect of the amount of food, but also a qualitative aspect of the quality of the food. So in a sense, the ambition was to identify questions or measures or data that can be easily collected that allow you to determine these two attributes that characterize food consumption. And the way they did it, however, was by pretending to give ex ante objective weights to different categories of food consumption that should reflect the qualitative aspect. Hence, for one occasion of dairy consumption is worth 4 times an occasion of grain consumption, 2 times an occasion of sugar consumption, and so on. I'm not an expert, but I know how it works. The point here is that there is a mix between some concept that is based on nutritional principles and the data that you collect, but there is nowhere a theory that links the two and say, okay, what is the probability that somebody who I would like to consider having poor food consumption, what is the probability that will report having consumed this particular combination of foods? So this is something that can be done, should be done, but has never been done. So one of the propositions that in my career as a presumed expert of measurement in this area, I am proposing to our colleagues at WFP, who are those who have created the food consumption score, is that this should be done. You should develop a model very much similar to the Rasch model, in which you discover what is the best measure of food consumption based on the data that you can easily collect with your questionnaire. But this means that you have to renounce, to give up this idea of having arbitrary ex ante weights, and therefore even the composition of the groups. This is something that is done before, or in some cases is left to the respondent. You say, have you ever consumed, how many days during the last week you consumed grains? And then the person has to recognize, okay, what is this? I don't know, there is teff in Sudan, in Ethiopia. Is this a grain? It's not. What about millet? What about rice? What about, no? So there are many, many things that are just assumed, but there is no exploration of whether these are the best information that you could get in those conditions. But maybe going further in the theory of the Rasch model, we will clarify this. But Stefania, I want to clarify, to me, whatever assessment of food security you make using the food consumption score cannot be termed a measurement of food security. If anything, the food consumption score was intended to measure food consumption. But even what do we mean by food consumption is not clear. Is it quality? Is it dietary energy? Is it micronutrient content? There is no clarity on what is it, the attribute that we are measuring. Did I answer your question? Okay. So let's go now to a very, I call it a heuristic illustration of what is the analytic behind the Rasch model. So how do we get to the estimates? Next time, we will actually open a software, put some data in, and do it. But now I want to give you the intuition of what is behind. And what is behind is an application of maximum likelihood principle. So for those of you who have studied advanced statistics, inferential statistics, you have heard about the maximum likelihood. So this is a table in which there are the data that we have collected, okay? So each column is a question, and here are just put in the order in which we asked them. So question number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, and number 8. And then each row is a different respondent. So the first person I interviewed said yes, 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 no, yes, no, no. The second person said yes, yes, no, 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 and so on. And then I added one column here, which is called the row score. Row score is the simple sum, so that it's 5 for number 1, is 2 for number 2, is 8. This one said yes to all the questions. Simple, no? I mean, coding the data of the FIES, it's the simplest things ever. You cannot make mistake unless you want to make mistake on purpose. Just, you have to keep in mind, code as 1 if the answer is yes, 0 if the answer is no, and leave it missing, blank, if there is any other situation in which people don't know, don't want to respond, is not clear what they say. Okay? So now, what the Rasch model analytic does, and this goes back to Rebecca's point. The first thing you do is calculating the average by column. The average by column is just another way of saying what percentage of numbers are 1 compared to the total, because the average of a dichotomic variable at 0, 1 is just percentage. So can only be between 0 and 1, and the actual number is the percentage of affirmative response. So in this example, these are just fictional examples. Let's imagine that this is the result. You have 95% in your sample that have said yes to question number 1. 76% have said yes to question number 2. 82% have said yes to question number 3, and so on. Now, let me ask Rebecca a question. So, what would be the likely ranking of the items in order of severity? Which is the least severe item among these? Stefania, Q1. Yes. Why?
Because it has the highest score. It's almost close to 1, 0.95. So
95% of the people said yes.
Yes. So
therefore, it's almost a definition. This must be the least severe among these experiences, because it's the one that has been experienced by most people. The second one is not question number 2. The second one is question number 3. So the first result of the analysis of the data is that I can actually rank the question in order of severity. And so I need to switch question number 3 and question number 2, and also question number 5 and question number 6. So now I have just moved the columns so that you see there is a monotonic ranking of the items. Again, Rebecca, this is not given a priori, is a result of the analysis. In a different data set with the same 8 question, it come up differently. Now, and this is the final point, we are almost out. How do we now imagine the position of the respondent on this scale of severity? We are saying that on this hand, we have least severe, on this other hand, we have high severity. But now we want to position the respondent. And the information we have that we can use is how they responded to this item. So let's focus on respondent number 1. Respondent number 1 said yes, 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 no, no, no. So if you want to guess in this scale of severity, where is likely that the person number 1 is positioned? And just to give you a hint, remember this. This is the graph that compares the position of the respondent with the position of the items. Now, the data has revealed the position of the items. And we want to estimate, guess, imagine what is the position of the respondent. If you want to locate individual number 1 along this scale of severity, imagine that you have, maybe I can use a pen. This is my scale of severity. And I know that now the first item is here, the second here, the third here, fourth, and so on. I want to identify the position of this guy here, the respondent number 1. Where would I put him or her? Somebody says above 0.5. I cannot interpret that answer because I don't know what 0.5 means. There is no 0, no 1, nothing here. Remember, this is a heuristic model, just an illustration. I guess that respondent number 1 will be positioned somewhere between the location of the 6th question and the location on the 5th question. Because he has said yes to this question and no to this question. If we remember the theory of the Rasch model, the probability of responding is greater than 50% for the item to the left and is lower than 50% for the item to the right. So the Rasch model tells me that it's more likely that I say yes if the question is on my left, and is more likely that I say no if the question is on my right. Hence, the maximum likelihood guess of where this person is must be here. And the information that I use is because this is the position that is more consistent with the fact of having observed yes to this first question and no to the next question. If this guy was here, it would have been very strange that he had said yes to question number 3, number 2, number 4, and number 6. Therefore, is less likely that this person is here. This is the maximum likelihood estimate of the position of the respondent, because it's the one that is more consistent with what I observe. Of all the possible hypotheses, the one that is more consistent with these provided answers is if the person is here. Because the model would predict a probability greater than 0.5 to say yes, and less than 0.5 to say yes here. So it's actually very consistent with the model. Okay, I see you, all of you, next Thursday.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Carlo. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.